Welcome back to another episode of the Max Term Podcast. Kyle Stitch here alongside James Finch, and today we're going to look at the LA Kings situation a little bit as it relates to our contract projections. Those contract projections are at AFP Analytics on X, formerly Twitter, pinned right to the top. Can't miss them. We've been active with them, trying to put out what we got, and the Kings are in, I'll just say, interesting situation. So we appreciate you listening to this podcast. We're available on all major platforms. Give us kind of follow there on any of those platforms. Follow on X at AFP Analytics. Our personal accounts can be there. Any questions, anything you want clarification on, feel free to let us know. So the LA Kings don't have a ton of big names, but they have big names who are going to need new contracts this offseason. I guess I should say they don't have a ton of players, but they have big name players that need contracts this offseason. So right now we have contract projections for Quinton Byfield. We have a long-term and a short-term projection. It's kind of how we do our restricted free agents. Matt Roy, Arthur Kaliev, Blake Lizotte, Jordan Spence, Cam Talbot. So you might, if you're a Kings observer fan listening, you might realize Victor Arvidsson's not included in that. He's been injured too much missed too many games this season, but when we were kind of putting together these projections that we want a level of sample size for this season, so he wasn't included. We might include him eventually as he starts to play enough games to kind of get a sense of where his standing would be, make sure he's back fully healthy. Also doesn't include Phoenix Copley, who also is dealing with a long-term injury, unfortunately. And then David Rittich, who's been up, I guess I shouldn't say just came up, but who's been up for Copley. So basically the guys that have much more limited sample are not included in these projections. So I think we need to start at the top with Quinton Byfield.
Yeah, so this one is honestly a fun one because I think LA is finally, I shouldn't say finally because it's still very early in his career, but this year seems to be where we're really seeing a elite player or flashes of elite play with Quinton Byfield. And where it gets fun for us as two people who like to talk contracts and roster management, this is a big long-term versus short-term deal, and it's actually going to be kind of interesting to see what happens here. So Byfield, we've got a long term of 7 years at about 8.3. His short term, we've got 3 years at about 6.8. Now,
I would say more of a nice 6.9.
Correct. So I need glasses, I think. Yes, a nice 6.9. So big thing here is, as we would usually say for most of the top players, sign the long-term deal. Well, if you're the team, get the long-term deal done. If you're the player, a lot of times maybe sign the short-term. Might lead to a much more lucrative long-term deal. But that said, I think that decision is really going to decide how this offseason is going to go for the Kings. And a big part of that is because overall, projected cap space, about $23.3 million per cap friendly. And while Quinton Byfield's like the headliner of the Kings free agent class as an RFA, they've got a handful of others, and there's what I would say, I think you would say, a pretty significant UFA name, Matt Roy. We've got a projection of 4 years at about $5.6 million. Really, I think he's someone who is somewhat underrated, at least across the league, as just a pretty solid all-around defenseman. Those are the kind of the two big names, bigger contracts that the Kings are going to kind of have to decide how they fit in or don't fit in.
And I think the next name on the list kind of is the push and pull with Matt Roy, and that's Jordan Spence. So he's a restricted free agent, 2 years, basically $3 million per year is our projection for him right now. So both right shot defensemen, one younger but a little less established, a slightly less impact, especially defensively, and Spence. Roy, the more veteran player, really strong defensive impacts, and he's definitely not a slouch as far as offensive impacts go either. So it kind of depends on what direction the Kings want to go and how else they want to fill out their roster. So let's give quickly the projections for the other ones, and then we'll talk about kind of the glaring issue with the roster right now. So Arthur Kliev, 2 years, 2.7 we'll call it per season. Blake Lizotte, 2 years, 2.4 per season. And Cam Talbot, 1 year, $1.9 million per season. So the issue is we have their $23 million in cap space basically spoken for with just these players. That doesn't include, again, Victor Arvidsson, who's not going to be super cheap. So some tough decisions are going to have to be made, and that only includes a projection for one goalie, and that goalie is going to be 37 years old in Cam Talbot.
Yeah, and honestly, Cam Talbot was off to a pretty decent start considering, I think, what a lot of people thought of that move in the first place. Obviously, the big stretch of poor play hasn't gone so well for Talbot, but I would be fine with Talbot as kind of my backup, maybe a 1B type. But yeah, like you said, all these contracts added up, and it's pretty much a break even. There's not much space to work with, and it doesn't include Arvidsson. So pretty much if they want to run it back, they'll be able to. Now, where this gets interesting is, so you kind of mentioned the right shots, kind of how Roy and Spence could impact each other here. Just looking at the Kings, Drew Doughty, Matt Roy, you have Brandt Clark, and Jordan Spence. In theory, one can go. And the easy answer would be, okay, Matt Roy's unrestricted. He's going to get a pretty decent deal. He might be the one to go. So then you'd have Doughty, Clark, and Spence on the right side. That's not bad. Lacking kind of the strong defensive play that Matt Roy brings. But we take Matt Roy out of that calculation you just went through, and it frees up about $5.6 million. One of the more glaring needs on the roster, and this relates to what I kind of just said about Cam Talbot, is finding a true number one goalie. 5.6 could potentially do it. I think this conversation sort of has to involve another player in Kaliev, who it pretty much seems is going to be on his way out of Los Angeles. So that could be another about $2.7 million based off our projections that you can kind of take out of the calculation. Now, the way I look at this is, let's say you make a trade for a really good goalie. Let's say Kaliev's part of that. It could be Kaliev and maybe Spence for a goalie, and you might have room for that goalie and still have Matt Roy in that calculation. He fits the roster too. And then you'd have Doughty, Roy, Clark. Maybe Roy walks and you keep Spence, and you have that 5.6 from Roy that helps fit the goalie and some other pieces. So there's really a lot of options that they have to work with here. And another spot where they could kind of make up a little bit of chunk of change would be if they went short term instead of long term with Byfield, which I would really advise against doing so. But again, when you're right up against the cap, that could be something they do to gain not quite 1.5 in cap space.
So before I kind of dive into Byfield, I kind of want to say an unadvisable move I would have for the Kings is not getting value for any of whoever you end up losing of Roy, Spence, and Kaliev, because you have 3 good players. Your issue is you have a log jam, maybe a little bit of a fit, like a team fit issue where Kaliev might be a best idea for both parties to find a new fit, but he's not a bad player by any means, and I think there will be a trade market for him. So the kind of the easy way to move on is not give him a qualifying offer in the summer, so you basically don't retain the ability to sign him. He's free to talk to any team he wants. I would strongly advise against that. I would see if you can find a fit, and that's where it might make sense to package him with a Spence or someone else from the roster to maybe get an upgrade somewhere, whether that's in goal, whether that's on or shuffling your defense around a little bit, retooling that, or even at forward. So Byfield is, I fully agree with you. The Kings have to figure out a way to make it work long term, because he should be your future 1C. The problem is you already paid another player like they're your future 1C, but isn't performing that way in PL Dubois, or PL Dubois, I guess we're going with this season. Byfield, I think, might have raised some eyebrows in how close his long-term average annual value is to his short-term average annual value. And I think you just have to look at the recent contracts, or at least the comparable contracts. In short-term, like one of the contracts, or two of the, I guess, probably best contracts, Elias Pettersson and Matthew Tkachuk, those are just massive money deals. And that's where Byfield's going to be shooting for. The long-term deals have some other really good players, but you're going to notice the value really is just better for the team. Higher upside, but I mean the trade-off is Byfield gets his value. So let's get into some quick math here. So you kind of have to look at what the value of RFA years and UFA years, so restricted free agent years is, and unrestricted free agent years is. So for Byfield, we're saying $6.9 million for restricted years. So he's got 4 of those left. So if each of those years was valued at 6.9, that would take him right to unrestricted free agency. We're then buying basically 3 future unrestricted free agent years. So I think kind of how our math's working out here is we're placing his unrestricted free agent value at about $11.2 million. So if we were to take that 11.2 and subtract from the 8, we're kind of left with $4 million that needs to be spread across other years. $1.4 million per year difference between the 8.3 to 6.8, so that kind of gets us to that value. So I think we're valuing his unrestricted years about $11 million, which I think is very much in line with what a top center wing flexible player would get in today's market. I think one of the top comparable players we have for his long-term contract is Leon Draisaitl, who, if Byfield's Leon Draisaitl, I think everyone's happy. And I don't think that that's an outrageous comp. I mean, he doesn't have the production yet, but Draisaitl's been a center/wing, and his next contract's easily going to be $12 to $13 plus million. So valuing Byfield, I think where we kind of have him makes a lot of sense here. It's just the strength of the comps, the strength of the player keeps this deal on both sides really, really high. But again, LA has to find a way to make the long-term deal work.
Yeah, and I think he's really become a solid all-around player. He's playing on the wing a lot, but he's also playing with Kopitar a lot. So that kind of makes sense. It almost kind of fits the Draisaitl comparison a little bit of you're a good center, but you might be playing on the wing at times. So, yeah, I think I'm very comfortable with where those projections are. As far as how it relates to the team, you got to find a way to go long term there. It's not a huge difference as far as the cap hit, and you're buying 4 more years. And I think kind of the way this shakes out, I think it's very doable. You get that long-term deal done, and where the give is probably on defense somewhere, whether it's Roy or you move on from a Spence through trade. I guess I would kind of like to give an idea here. I think it would make a lot of sense for both teams. I think there could be some sort of deal to be had between the Kings and the Predators. You say Saros' name has come up a little bit in the past couple of weeks, and their situation in Nashville is they've got Saros, a very good goaltender, but you've also got one of the top goalie prospects in Askarov, who's come up a little bit, played well. I think Nashville should turn Saros into some assets. I think the Kings have some assets. I would try and do something along the lines of you keep Byfield, you re-sign Matt Roy, and then maybe you can package a Jordan Spence and an Arthur Kaliev together, who put together would be about $5.5 million. Based off of our projections, their contracts they will eventually sign. If you package them together, maybe there's a couple picks that need to be thrown in there too. You would get Saros at a $5 million AAV, and that would fit.
I think another goalie name that the exact same logic applies to, Linus Ullmark as well from Boston. I think that makes a ton of sense. It helps Boston's depth, especially if they have to move on from DeBrusk, or DeBrusk decides to leave in free agency. Kaliev would be a nice kind of fit to replace DeBrusk, and then also improve your depth on the back end while still having Jeremy Swayman available. So that either of those options I think make sense for both teams involved. Like, those would be good hockey trades.
Yes.
Yeah, maybe there's some picks or some other smaller prospect, but as far as centerpieces and starting points for this deal, for one of those deals, this makes a lot of sense. And since we're throwing out fun fits, I don't know if it makes a ton of sense in season, especially with Matt Roy being an unrestricted free agent. But to me, I wonder if the Kings could use a cost-controlled forward. The Buffalo Sabres need a right-shot defenseman to pair with Owen Power on their second pair. They also have a surplus of cost-controlled young forwards that someone could easily come into the Kings and fill that need for 3 years on an entry-level contract. I don't think that's happening if the Sabres especially are far out of the playoffs. I don't think they're buying a rental player. If there's a long-term deal in place, maybe we can have that conversation, but maybe the same could be said for Jordan Spence, but I don't know if he's the same type of fit for the Sabres, but there could be something there depending on how things shape out and maybe if a contract's in place.
Yeah, so I think that's definitely something where they would have to have an extension done with Roy to have that make sense. That said, I think the fit is great. I think the trade matchup between the two teams is great. And I will say Roy of the defensemen, I think, would be the clear better fit for Buffalo with the stronger defensive impacts. Spence, is on his way to being good, but we've seen a little more offensive ability, better offensive impacts than defensive from him. So I like that idea a lot. And the one thing I will say, it's probably not likely, but both teams are kind of in a spot right now where, in theory, they could use a shakeup. That could potentially be it. Now, does Matt Roy want to sign an extension right now with the Buffalo Sabres? I don't know because of how that situation's gone. But it's an idea. It's an idea that makes sense. The fit would be there. Since you threw that idea out there, I think it would make some sense. Maybe we just do it with Matt Roy. I don't think Lizotte and Talbot are really big enough UFA names, but Matt Roy is going to be part of actually a pretty solid UFA defenseman class, but he should very much be getting a look as someone who most likely settles in as like a very good second pair guy for a team, and we've got him in kind of that cap hit range at about 5.6. It's about what you would expect for a good second pair. Any fits out there with other teams?
So one I think that has been in the rumor mill for this type of defenseman is the Ottawa Senators with Chris Tanev. I don't know if we've explicitly said it this episode, but Matt Roy's in that same mold, but probably better. So Ottawa could make a lot of sense for Matt Roy. I feel like they have their eyes set on Tanev for intangible reasons that maybe they don't perceive Matt Roy to have, but I think that would be a tremendous fit there. We've talked in the past on depending on how the Florida Panthers kind of blue line shakes up. If someone leaves, he could go in there. Same with the Carolina Hurricanes. If someone or some players leave from that blue line, could fit in. Montreal Canadiens could use a solid, steady veteran presence. The Leafs could certainly use a solid, steady veteran presence. Whether cap-wise that's going to work out, I don't know. I mean, I think there's a lot of teams that really could use him. He's kind of, again, he's a very under-the-radar type defenseman, but he's been just steady for years now.
Yeah, I want to throw out one more team that I would like to see add some pieces, and I really think a defenseman like Roy on a 4-year deal like we have projected would make a lot of sense. Follow Sean Durzi over to Arizona. Up-and-coming team who I think would really benefit from having someone who is as good defensively as Roy is. That's kind of I don't know if I even want to call them a sneaky fit for players like Roy, because I think they're on enough of the, not playoffs yet, but borderline playoff picture that they could be a decent landing spot for a lot of free agents.
Then one more team I want to throw out, kind of a contending team. The Dallas Stars could really use a really good, steady veteran like Matt Roy back there as well, especially with the kind of emergence recently of Thomas Harley. Matt Roy, Thomas Harley as your like second pair. I mean, that's tremendous. That's tremendous, and that would be a great fit for that organization.
That's already a very strong overall defensive team usually. I think that would be a great fit for them, and honestly, it's hard to poke holes with the Stars, but if you're able to add someone like Matt Roy, you do it, and I think it would strengthen their defense quite a bit.
So I really think the interesting question with the Kings is what direction they head as the trade deadline starts to approach, and they've kind of been in a little bit of a downward spiral, whether they make this move or not. But I think the important thing is they need to know how these players potentially fit in. Probably the kind of elephant in the room is Victor Arvidsson. We don't have a projection. We don't have him including in our projections, but that doesn't mean he's not going to be in line for decent contracts, especially if he comes back and is solid for about half of the season, a little bit under half of the season, he's probably looking at least a similar AAV to what he's coming off of.
I would think if he comes back and is a similar Victor Arvidsson, that would be like a very pretty much the floor of what I would expect. He's coming off a little over $4 million, I think, and I would expect at least in the fives if he's healthy, scoring goals. The other interesting thing to kind of watch here is we mentioned adding a goalie, and I think overall that would be very important for the Kings. And if I'm the Kings, it's number one on my list. But if you trade Kaliev, you bring in other players, you make other moves, and you can't keep an Arvidsson, all of a sudden the depth on the wing is not where it was, and now that's a hole. So they can make this work, I think, and have a very solid team, but they do need to be a little bit careful where maybe they try and shore up one hole and it ends up creating another one.
I think it really all comes back to almost where I started this episode. So here we go, full circle as we kind of get to the end here. If they hadn't made that PL Dubois trade, a lot of the things that you had just laid out as their issues would not be issues right now. They'd have more cap space. They could move a winger because they'd still have plenty of depth there, or I guess lose two wingers and still have enough depth there, and they'd easily have the cap space to sign a goalie. And by the way, Byfield would just be playing center instead of probably wing right now, and that probably is okay as well. So the Kings, one bad move, I wouldn't say it's bad, but one maybe lackluster move.
It's starting to be questioned a little bit, especially with this poor stretch they've had. So maybe not bad, but yeah, it's questionable right now.
Questionable, lackluster, yep. And that could be the kind of move that takes them from like hot rebuild into cup contender team into, oh, we pushed the gas down a little bit too hard and we got caught doing it and kind of are facing the consequences of that. So it's kind of a LA Kings little look. Got some tough decisions to make. They have, in theory, enough space to make most of it work, but that's not necessarily going to improve their roster, and that's where the tough decisions are going to have to be made. So we appreciate you giving us a listen. Appreciate you checking out the full contract projections at AFP Analytics on Twitter, subscribing to this podcast, Max Term Podcast, available on pretty much every single major platform you might listen to a podcast on. And with that, we'll talk to you next time.